You wake up, not to an alarm clock, but to the shrill honk of a goose being strangled somewhere outside your wooden shutter. The straw mattress underneath you, if you can even call it that, smells like wet dog, with just a hint of moldy goat. Your back hurts. But that's okay. Everyone's back hurts in 1321. It's not a symptom. It's a feature. You roll over and immediately regret it. There's a splinter the size of an entire philosophy degree embedded in your palm now, courtesy of your wooden bed frame, handcrafted by a unnamed Oswin who once mistook a bench for a coffin and just rolled with it. Your room is dim. The only light comes from a gap between the shutters, where a brave little beam of sunlight is trying, unsuccessfully, to cut through the gloom like a medieval therapist trying to address your chronic sadness using only leeches and prayer. Your bladder is full, your hands are dirty, and your mind is already thinking about letters. Not taxes, not war, not bubonic plague. Letters. That is, the kind of letter you write to someone else using a quill, some parchment, and enough passive aggression to fill a monastery. Because you, yes, you, are literate. Congratulations. You're in the top 1% of people who can actually read and write. Your parents are thrilled. Or they would be, if they weren't dead from that one winter when all the oats molded and your uncle ate too much bad pork and started speaking in tongues. But never mind that. You swing your legs over the side of the bed and put your feet into your shoes, which are technically just two pieces of boiled leather pretending to be footwear. They squelch. You choose not to investigate further. Outside, someone is shouting about stolen chickens. Someone else is vomiting into a ditch. The bells of the local church are ringing like they're being punished. Welcome to your medieval morning. And before you snuggle into the safety of your blanket or sink deeper into this surprisingly soothing spiral of historical despair, take a second to like this video and subscribe, but only if you actually enjoy this kind of historical chaos. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. Because someone always says it's 3:11 a.m. in Canada and someone else chimes in from a bathtub in Lisbon. It never gets old. Anyway, letters. You walk across the room and sit at your writing desk, which is actually just a box with legs. You take out a sheet of parchment, which costs more than your niece's dowry, and unfurl it like a man unrolling his last nerve. You dip your quill, made from a literal bird feather, into some iron gall ink that smells like death and vinegar and the slow collapse of your medieval immune system. You are ready to write. But what do you write? Let's be clear. Medieval people didn't send quick texts like WID or you up or please bring THX. There's no medieval emoji for passive rage or social anxiety. These people had to craft every word by hand. Slowly. Carefully. With zero backspace. You mess up a sentence? Too bad. That ink's already seeping into the fibers like a bad decision into your life trajectory. Medieval letters were not only practical, they were emotional dumping grounds, confessionals, therapy sessions, passive-aggressive salvos, love notes, and bureaucratic hellscapes all rolled into one scroll. They were status symbols. They were sometimes dictated to a scribe because you were too busy or too incompetent or too noble to do it yourself. Sometimes they were written in Latin, just to show off how smart and unbearable you were. And sometimes they were in Old French or Middle English or even Arabic, depending on where exactly in the historical fever dream you're standing. But what did people actually write? Well, let's take a deep breath, preferably not through your nose, because the chamber pot hasn't been emptied since Tuesday, and explore that. Some of the earliest surviving personal letters come from monasteries, which makes sense. Monks loved writing. Monks were basically the human printers of the Middle Ages, except slower and more likely to burst into Gregorian chant mid-sentence. They wrote letters to other monks, to bishops, to kings, to abbots who owed them butter. Yes, actual letters demanding butter. Picture this, it's the year 996. You're a monk named Wulfstan. You live in a stone building that is colder than a witch's armpit. You haven't bathed in 6 weeks because cleanliness is next to godlessness, apparently. And you write a letter to your fellow brother Godric, politely requesting that he please stop sending drunk pilgrims to your abbey. You sign off with "May God show you mercy," unlike your guests, and then you underline it twice, because medieval monks didn't have sarcasm fonts yet. Letters weren't just for monks, of course. Nobles wrote letters constantly. There are entire collections of them, preserved in archives that smell like historical mildew and disappointment. Take, For example, the Paston letters. These are from the 15th century, written by the Paston family, a deeply chaotic English gentry clan with land, ambition, and zero chill. Their letters read like a reality TV show with plague episodes. There's Agnes Paston, the terrifying matriarch who once wrote to her son telling him that unless he married the girl she wanted, she would disown him faster than you could say primogeniture. Then there's her son John Paston, who basically lived at war with half the county because land ownership in medieval England was like trying to play Monopoly while blindfolded and drunk. The letters contain details like "My neighbor stole my oxen, please send help," and "The Duke is being a bastard again, and tell Cousin William to stop borrowing our horses." They are messy. They are personal. They are deeply, deeply relatable. You begin to realize that people back then were exactly like us. Just colder, and smellier, and more likely to die from a stub toe. There's one letter from Margaret Paston, John's long-suffering wife, where she writes about how she's trying to keep the estate running while her husband is off fighting lawsuits and getting himself arrested. She ends the letter with a phrase that translates loosely to, "Hope this finds you well. Everything's on fire. Love you anyway." That's marriage in the Middle Ages. Now, lest you think letters were all about land disputes and emotionally distant wives trying to get their husbands to answer their medieval DMs, there were also love letters. Oh yes, people in the Middle Ages were horny, but they were horny with decorum. There's a stunning cache of love letters from the 12th century between Heloise and Abelard, two French intellectuals who make every modern situationship look like a kindergarten friendship bracelet gone wrong. Heloise was a brilliant scholar. Abelard was her tutor. Then they fell in love, had an affair, got caught, and her uncle had him castrated. Yes, you heard that right. Castrated. With medieval tools. Which were not, let's say, precision instruments. After that, they both joined religious orders and began a series of heart-wrenching, emotionally complicated letters that are still read today by people who enjoy suffering in literary form. Heloise basically invented the art of the emotionally devastating paragraph. She writes things like, "God knows I never sought anything in you except yourself, and I would rather be damned with you than saved without you," which is romantic until you remember he's a monk now and technically isn't allowed to text back. "You sip your weak ale," which is safer than water because the river upstream is currently hosting several corpses and a dead pig, and you wonder what kind of letters people would write about you if you were a noble or a monk or a woman named Margaret trying to find her husband while the estate collapses. Would someone write to you asking for advice about hiring servants? Would they complain about your handwriting, which looks like a goose flew across the page while sneezing? Would they beg you to return the borrowed candlesticks from last Michaelmas? Maybe. Maybe not. But the thing is, letters mattered. They were the medieval version of status updates, of subtweets, of wedding RSVPs and court summons and "sorry I burned your house down, hope we're cool" notes. They were long. They were specific. They were occasionally whiny. And they were always real, even if they were written in Latin and sealed with wax. You shuffle some papers on your desk, trying not to spill ink on your only clean tunic. Your hands are cold. Your fingers are stained. Somewhere outside, a cow is mooing like it's seen the abyss and wants to file a formal complaint. You dip the quill again and begin writing your own letter. It starts with, "To the most noble and gracious Lord, who still owes me 6 sacks of barley and a pig." You smile, because even if no one ever reads it, at least you got to complain in writing, just like everyone else for the past 1,000 years. And so, as the ink dries and your breath fogs in the morning chill, remember this. You are a speck in the grand disaster of human correspondence. And somehow, that's kind of comforting. You're still at your desk. Your inkpot has developed a crust, like all things medieval. Your back has locked into a permanent angle best described as quill-ready. And your candle is sputtering like it's reconsidering the entire concept of light. Outside, someone is arguing with a chicken, and you stop questioning these things. You've written 2 letters this morning already, one to a neighboring manor about a fence that's been mysteriously repositioned 4 feet into your property, and another to your cousin Bertram asking him to please return the family seal ring and stop pretending he's a baron. He is not a baron. He is a dampman with debt. But before you start your 3rd letter, you pause to think, what kind of letters did people really send? Yes, there were land disputes and estate drama, and your ox trampled my herbs messages. But medieval people weren't one-note characters. They were messy. which means their letters were even messier. Let's start with the "I'm dying, here's what I want" letter. These were, understandably, not upbeat. Because once you start a medieval sentence with "if I do not recover from this fever," things aren't going great. These letters are a hybrid between a will, a last confession, and an awkward apology note to your cousin who you once hit with a pewter mug at a feast. There's one from a man named Richard Castu, a priest who wrote a farewell note before dying in 1420. He asked his friends to pray for his soul, forgave his enemies, and reminded everyone that he never kept gold for himself. Which, when translated from polite church Latin, means, if anyone's counting, I didn't steal the chalice. Then there's the real tear-jerkers. Imagine you're a knight, riddled with arrow wounds, lying in a French meadow that smells like blood and disappointment. Your squire is crying. The birds are circling. And you scribble out a note to your wife saying you regret missing your daughter's birth. You seal it with wax. Hand it to the squire. Hope he makes it. Spoiler, he doesn't. The letter ends up in an archive 5 centuries later, where a grad student finds it and cries into her third espresso at 2 a.m. That's legacy. But not all deathbed letters were so noble. Some were just petty. Like, "If I die, tell Oswald he still owes me 5 shillings and that the fish he sold me last Lent was suspiciously bloated." You know. Medieval closure. Next up, letters to powerful people who will definitely not read them. This was basically medieval LinkedIn. You'd write to the king, or a duke, or your liege lord, begging for a job or a favor or clemency after that unfortunate pig-stealing incident. These letters are full of flattering phrases, like "your most obedient servant grovels at your magnificent feet," and "my humble self, a speck of dust in your glorious path." It's less communication, more grovelcore. One example is from a poor knight who wrote to the King of England asking for his pension to be reinstated after it was mysteriously redirected. He describes himself as loyal in heart, though meager in purse, which is the polite medieval way of saying, "Please, I am broke, and I have 6 children, one of whom is possibly cursed." Sometimes these letters worked. More often, they were tossed in a pile and eaten by rats. But people still wrote them. Because that's what hope looks like in a time without HR departments. Now let's talk about letters of complaint. Yes, the backbone of human civilization. If there is one unifying thread in human history, it is this: people love to complain. There's a letter from 1392 where a woman writes to a merchant about receiving sour wine and spoiled cloth and demands he send replacements or face God's judgment and the wrath of her husband. Which is code for, "I will start a vendetta." Another nobleman once wrote a letter entirely dedicated to complaining that the fish in his shipment smelled stronger than the devil's armpit. Not metaphorically. That's the actual phrase used. Apparently, medieval fishmonger Yelp was absolutely savage. And you'd think these letters would be dry and formal, but no, some of them are deeply personal. Like a letter from a woman named Constance, who tells her cousin that the tailor who made her gown must be blind or cruel, for the sleeves hang like dead men's arms. Then she adds, "I wore it anyway, for I am not made of coin." Iconic. 10 centuries later and I still want to invite her to brunch. Now, of course, no conversation about personal letters would be complete without gossip. Oh yes, medieval people loved to spill tea. If you think modern drama is spicy, let me introduce you to 14th century ecclesiastical politics, extramarital affairs, and that one time someone accused the baker of witchcraft because his rye bread gave everyone hallucinations. There's a letter from a monk to his brother that says, and I'm paraphrasing, "Brother Thomas has been seen too often in the company of Sister Margaret, and though she claims to be teaching him Latin, I fear their conjugations extend beyond grammar." Savage. Even better. He ends the letter with, "We pray for their souls, but not for their discretion." Even royal courts weren't immune. Courtiers sent letters filled with whispers, who had fallen from favor, who was sleeping with whom, who had gout so bad he could barely kneel in chapel. These tidbits were not just for entertainment, they were political weapons. If you knew someone's secret, you owned them. Or, at least got invited to better feasts. Sometimes the letters get wonderfully petty. "My dear Alice, Lady Warwick's dress at the banquet was of green velvet, so loud it gave me a headache. I fear she has mistaken fashion for warfare." Or, "Dear brother, our cousin Edward has taken to quoting the Psalms at dinner. I suspect a girl is involved." These are real sentiments. Real people. And not one of them had spell check. Then we have the love letters that are trying way too hard. Look, not everyone is a poet. But that didn't stop medieval lovers from trying. There's one surviving note from a 15th century suitor that begins, "Your eyes are twin candles that burn in my soul's window." Which sounds romantic until you realize wax candles back then drip constantly and attracted rats. Unfortunate image. Another man wrote to his beloved, "If I could bottle your voice, I would drink it every morning like warm ale." That's either touching or a health code violation. Either way, it probably worked. People were lonely. Some lovers were a bit more direct. "Dearest, I wish to kiss the place where your foot last stepped," one wrote. To which she presumably replied, "Please stop sniffing my shoes, Gregory." And then there's the infamous Renaissance Tinder moment, the letters exchanged between Henry VIII and Bullen before the whole beheading incident. He wrote things like, "I would rather be with you than with my realm," and she responded with subtle flirtation and political maneuvering, because she was playing 4D chess while everyone else was playing mud pies. But love letters weren't always sweet. Sometimes they were clingy, or desperate, or, in one case, written after the woman had already joined a convent. A man named Jean wrote several letters to a nun he had once loved, asking her to renounce her vows and marry him. She, very politely, declined. Multiple times. By the fourth letter, she finally wrote, "God is my spouse now. He has more patience than you." Burn. Now let's pivot briefly to family letters, which are basically the original group chat you can't leave. Parents wrote to children. Children wrote to their parents. In one letter, a father in 1378 tells his son at university to cease spending coin on dice and taverns and consider the vocation of wool, which is more honest than books. Imagine sending your kid to college and then begging him to drop out to become a sheep merchant. Peak parenting. Mothers, of course, were guilt-tripping champions. One letter from a 15th century woman to her son includes the line, "If I die before your next visit, know that your absence hastened my departure." You can almost hear the sigh from across the centuries. Siblings were equally chaotic. There's a letter from a sister to her brother saying, "I have heard you've taken a falcon as a pet, and that it now lives in the hall. Is this wise?" He never responded. The falcon lived another 10 years. And finally, we arrive at the letters that just make no sense. Sometimes people wrote down their thoughts like journal entries and sent them as letters. One man sent his friend a 2-page rant about how much he hated turnips. Another described a dream where he was chased by a goat who spoke Latin. And one lady spent an entire letter detailing how her cat had a better sense of direction than her husband. You know what? I believe her. You stretch. Your neck pops. Your ink has dried into a flake the size of an almond. Your candle is now officially more smoke than fire. And still, the letters keep coming. Because for all their dirt, drama, and dysentery, medieval people needed letters. They were lifelines, vents, evidence that someone, somewhere, was thinking of you, even if it was to demand the return of a chicken or remind you that your debts were, in fact, eternal. So you write one more. Just one. To my dearest friend, I send this letter with frozen fingers and a mind full of mud. The rain is endless. The goats have escaped again. My cousin is insufferable. But you, I hope you are warm and dry and far from this chaos. You seal it with wax. Press your signet ring into it. And then stare out the window, where twilight has begun to fall over a world that somehow feels a little less lonely now. Because someone, somewhere, will read your words and maybe smile. You wake up to the sound of something leaking. It could be the thatched roof. Could be your roofmate's nose. Could be divine punishment for the letter you wrote yesterday, where you implied your cousin's wife was plump with sin. Either way, you're damp again. Which, to be fair, is your default medieval setting. You crawl out of your straw mattress, which smells like betrayal and goat. Again, the goat is not yours. It just visits. You shuffle to your desk, light your candle, and stare at a stack of half-dried letters that make modern email inboxes look emotionally well-adjusted. There are letters about debts, letters about land, letters about someone losing a shoe in a swamp and treating it like a national emergency. But today, you're focused on one type of letter, the help me, I'm broke genre. These were distressingly common. Because in the Middle Ages, money was less of a liquid asset and more of a distant concept whispered about in taverns. You didn't have money. You knew someone who might owe you money. And that person just moved to Flanders with no forwarding address. Hence, the begging letters. A friar might write to a wealthy donor asking for relief for the poor, which really meant please help patch the roof before the choir collapses through the nave. A widow might write to her late husband's cousin, reminding him of his sacred duty to support her children, especially since said children were now growing thin from porridge and prayer. There's one from a student in Paris, writing home to his father in 1270. He says, and this is nearly a quote, "I am forced upon my books to buy bread. And the innkeeper says I owe him more than I weigh." Classic. No money, no books, just vibes and hunger. He ends the letter with a gentle but effective threat. If I do not receive aid soon, I fear I must take holy orders, for at least the monastery feeds its own. Translation: send coin or your son becomes a monk and you get no grandchildren. But it wasn't just the poor begging. Oh no. Nobles begged too, just more politely. A baron might write to the king, "I humbly request a loan of 10 marks to repair my northern wall, which has been battered by weather and bandits alike." He might then follow that with, "And I remain your most faithful servant, praying for your long and glorious reign, and never mentioning the time I supported the wrong heir in that war last spring." And sometimes, the desperation breaks through the politeness like a sheep through a loose fence. "My lord, I have no bread, no meat, and less dignity. I write with trembling hand and hollow belly. Should your mercy be moved, I shall name my next son after you, regardless of whether it suits his face." That's one way to get coin. Then there's the letters about illness. Nothing quite as medieval as a detailed account of someone's bodily functions. These letters are basically the 14th century version of WebMD. If WebMD was written by your aunt who used leeches recreationally, you'd get letters like, "My dearest friend, I write to inform you of my recent affliction. A choleric humor has overtaken my liver, and I fear my spleen has migrated. The physician recommends I drink boiled thistle water and avoid excitement. Please send prayers and soft cheese." Or from a husband to his wife, "Since your departure, my stomach has become unruly and my bowels unpredictable. I miss you terribly. Also, the bed has fleas." That's love. One noblewoman wrote her mother to say she feared she was possessed by melancholy, which at the time could mean anything from seasonal depression to having read a sad poem once. Her mother's reply was helpful: "Take walks in gardens. Avoid thinkers. Eat more figs." Honestly, not bad advice. And let's not forget the plague letters. These were usually short because people writing them were, well, dying. But they often included detailed instructions. "If I perish, bury me near the north wall of St. Cuthbert's, not near Uncle Roland, for I cannot stand his company even in death." You know you've held a grudge when you're planning your ghost social circle. Now we move on to the "You Wronged Me" letters. A personal favorite. You see, medieval people had no Twitter, no anonymous subtweeting. If you wanted to vent your rage, you had to do it with wax seals and passive aggression. Some of these were legal in nature. "You have taken 3 of my pigs, which I mark with blue paint in God's justice. I ask for their return," or "a duel at dawn." Others were more emotional. "You promised to marry my daughter, then fled with the apothecary's niece. She has a squint and a sour disposition. Return at once, or be cursed by every hen in our village." A few are just blistering in tone. "My lord, I am most dismayed to learn of your slander, that I am a glutton and a thief. I have stolen nothing but patience, and I eat only to stay alive. Your words wound more deeply than your sword, which you swing like a drunkard in a windstorm." Now that's how you roast someone in iambic pentameter. One particularly salty merchant wrote to his former business partner, "The wool you sold me is riddled with mites. I wrapped it around my wife, and she developed a rash. I now question both your wares and your morals." And in the margin, his wife added, "Tell his wife I said hello. We met at market. She looked tired." That's a 2-for-1 burn. Let's take a brief detour into the travelogue letter genre. These are long, boring, detailed accounts of roads, weather, and bad soup. "My dearest sister, I have arrived at York after 6 days' ride. The roads were mud, the inns were worse, and I was thrown from my horse twice, though I did land on something soft, possibly a priest. I am bruised but upright." These letters often included updates like, "The river Ouse is swollen, the bridge is broken, and the ferryman is drunk again." Followed by, I met a monk who claims he's seen St. Edmund's ghost riding a pig. I remained skeptical. And some letters were nothing but weather reports. The rain is constant. The wind howls. I have developed a fungus between my toes that may be sentient. You imagine the recipient reading this by candlelight and nodding, like, ah yes, Yorkshire. Then we have the deeply strange letters to God, saints, and dead relatives. People would write these letters and sometimes bury them in church walls or tuck them into shrines. It was a kind of spiritual messaging system, like medieval SMS, but slower and with more incense. One widow wrote a letter to St. Catherine, asking her to intercede in a property dispute. She included a drawing of her neighbor, who she described as greedy, flat-footed, and incapable of mercy. Someone else wrote to their dead mother, I miss your stew. I have burned the pot 3 times. Send guidance. Which is not exactly theologically sound, but very sweet. There's also one strange letter from a knight to St. George. If you grant me victory in tomorrow's skirmish, I shall build you a chapel with stained glass and good acoustics. If I die, please make sure it's dignified. Spoiler, he did not die. The chapel had excellent acoustics. And finally, we come to the unhinged letters. The ones where someone clearly needed therapy, but all they had was a goose quill and too much mead. Like the monk who sent a 6-page letter to his former lover, now a nun, describing his dreams, his regrets, and the exact weight of his sorrow, which he estimated at 4 stones. He ends the letter by quoting Virgil and drawing a small picture of a snail. Another letter, from a jilted woman, includes a phrase, I hope the fleas of 1,000 dogs infest your beard, and that your wine turns to vinegar on your lying tongue. She also ends with a drawing of a donkey, wearing a crown. You close the letter, you sigh, and you realize people have not changed. Not really. They still beg. They still flirt. They still insult each other in writing and then pretend they didn't mean it. They still get sick and scared and tired and whiny. They still overshare and underdeliver. And some of them, even in 1312, wrote letters just to say, I saw a rainbow today. It made me think of you. And you, tired, ink-stained, slightly damp, you write back. Because even if the world is full of fleas and plague and turnip theft, a letter is a kind of anchor. A way to say, I'm still here. I still care. And also, please return my axe. You wake up at dawn, not because you wanted to, but because a rooster somewhere has deep personal issues and a total disregard for boundaries. The air smells like damp wood, old shoes, and whatever your neighbor's chimney has decided to burn this week. Possibly cabbage. Possibly something less legal. You stretch, pull your wool blanket closer. It itches, because of course it does, and think about the letter you meant to write last night. Something about rent, or missing tools, or your brother's inexplicably large gambling debt. But instead you fell asleep with a candle burning and a quill poking your neck. And now it's time to deal with your medieval inbox. Today, we're wading knee-deep into the category of medieval love letters. And yes, they're just as melodramatic, emotionally unstable, and questionably phrased as you'd expect. You'd think that, in a time when people rarely bathed, had 4 teeth, and couldn't spell their own names the same way twice, romance would take a backseat to survival. But no. Apparently, nothing says I love you like a handwritten letter comparing your beloved's face to the moon and their breath to a soft sheep. One of the most famous medieval love letters comes from Abelard and Heloise. You might remember them from history class, or from that time your teacher said forbidden love and someone giggled. Long story short, philosopher guy tutors noble girl. They fall in love. Things get wild. Then things get violent. There's a secret child, a forced marriage, an unfortunate incident involving a pair of scissors and a revenge plot. Look, it's a whole thing. But their letters to each other? Pure, emotional overload. Abelard writes, even in the cloister, my thoughts stray to you. My longing torments me. Your name is written in my heart's blood. Very romantic. Very problematic. Also, very medieval man with unresolved guilt issues. Heloise replies, I would rather be your mistress than the Queen of Heaven. Which is kinda sweet until you remember that this was written from a nunnery, where she had been put against her will, after he became a monk. Again, it's a lot. Their love letters are famous for a reason. But they were not unique. Across Europe, people were scribbling their feelings down in the margins of psalters, on bits of parchment, and occasionally, when desperate, on the backs of tax records. You might find something like this. To my dearest Clarice, when I think of your hair, my thoughts turn golden. When I think of your laugh, I weep, for the sound has not graced my ears since Easter. I write to you now with fingers cold and heart hot. Poetic. Until you realize it's written in the middle of a request for cheese and oats. That's right, most love letters were mixed in with daily logistics. Because parchment was expensive and romance wasn't always a full-time job. So you get gems like, Beloved, I send you my longing and this month's taxes. Tell your father I'll return the plowshare once the barley's in. Nothing says eternal devotion like agricultural scheduling. And the metaphors? Oh, the metaphors. Medieval lovers had no chill. They compared their crushes to roses, stars, angels, deer, and occasionally saints, which feels a bit sacrilegious, but okay. My love, your eyes shine brighter than the candles at St. Bartholomew's, and your skin is softer than the wax thereof. You imagine the recipient reading that and thinking, wow, thanks. I guess I look like church furniture. But not all love letters were sweet. Some were dangerously clingy. I saw you at the feast. You did not see me, but I watched. I watched as you danced. You laughed with another man. Was he your cousin? Say he was your cousin. Write me. Soon. This is 1378's version of You Up. And sometimes, people wrote romantic letters on behalf of others. Professional scribes, men who were literate and had decent handwriting, were often paid to write letters for lovesick clients. Imagine showing up at your village scribe's cottage and dictating. Tell her her beauty burns like the forge, and I am but a lump of iron longing to be shaped by her hands. And the scribe, who's 56, hasn't been touched since 1299, is just nodding, quill twitching, resisting the urge to correct your metaphor. There's even a preserved letter from a knight writing to a noblewoman, saying, My heart is pierced by your smile. My soul is captive in your eyes. I would fight 10 Turks for a single glance and march barefoot through thorns for your kiss. Which is touching, except that it ends with P.S. Can your uncle still supply grain? Multitasking. Now, let's talk breakup letters. Yes, they existed. And yes, they were brutal. My lady, though you are fair, your tongue is sharper than a mill blade, and your temper more sour than a week-old turnip. I seek peace, and in you, I find only noise. Farewell. Oof. Another classic from a nun to her former betrothed. Yes, another nun. This happens a lot. I loved you once, before God took my heart. Now I see that he was saving me. May you find joy in ale and dice, for surely virtue has eluded you. Medieval ghosting, but with divine justification. Of course, there were also the sad letters. The ones written after death or near it. A husband to his wife, before heading to battle. If I do not return, know that my last thought was of your hand in mine. Bury me near the linden tree, where you first kissed me, and where I first knew joy. You can almost hear the candle sputtering as he seals it, tears mixing with ink. Then you have secret letters, hidden in shoes, sewn into hems, or smuggled in pies. Yes, actual pies. In 15th century England, one young woman reportedly baked a love note into a meat pie sent to her imprisoned lover. Authorities found it. She was scolded. The pie was eaten anyway. No word on whether love triumphed. And sometimes, love letters weren't even written to a person. They were written to love itself. I write, love, to you, not to a woman or a man, but to the force that makes fools sing and kings kneel. You are cruel and kind, soft and sharp. You are my master, and I, your thrall. This would be touching if it weren't written by someone who later tried to marry a goose. He was denied. The goose was unavailable. In short, medieval love letters were raw, desperate, poetic, messy, real, just like ours. They were full of hope and fear and bodily metaphors that really didn't age well. They said things like, your smile heals me more than any leech. Or, your absence wounds me worse than war. And they meant it. Because in a world where death was close, disease was constant, and affection was often forbidden, writing your feelings down was a radical act. It was saying, I see you. I miss you. I remember. Even if that memory smells like old parchment and damp wool. You roll up the letter. Tie it with a fraying ribbon. tuck it into your coat, and walk out into the fog, hoping it reaches the right hands, hoping it says what your mouth couldn't, and hoping, above all, that the candle you left burning doesn't set fire to the whole cottage. Because, insurance doesn't exist yet. You're sitting at the long communal table, which is less cozy kitchen aesthetic and more splinter traps surrounded by crumbs and regret. You've just eaten what may have been porridge or may have been something pretending to be porridge. Hard to tell. There were definitely barley husks involved, and possibly one weevil who just wanted to see how the other half lives. The candle on the table sputters. You reach for your writing kit. Some ink, a poorly sharpened quill, and a scrap of parchment that smells faintly of goat, but your hand hovers. You know what kind of letter this is going to be. A family letter. And not the fun kind, like, "Hey, Cousin Ethelstan, I heard you finally got that boil lanced. Congrats." No. This one is about money, or land, or some vague betrayal that happened 23 years ago and still lives rent-free in everyone's mind. Because in the medieval world, family letters were not warm expressions of love and support. They were more like legal documents wrapped in guilt, tied with a string of emotional blackmail, and then dipped in candle wax for drama. Let's begin with the most common theme. Dear Uncle, give me back my field. This is the bread and butter of medieval family drama. Picture it, your father dies. He leaves you a perfectly good half-acre of marginally farmable land and a cow that walks sideways. You go to claim it, only to find that your uncle, who hasn't worked a day since the famine of 41, has decided it's his now. And so, you write, "To the Honorable and once trusted Sir Auric, it has come to my attention that you occupy the land left by my late father. God rest his soul. I do not wish to involve the reeve, but I will if I must. Return the field, or may the saints judge between us." This letter will take 5 days to arrive, assuming no one drops it in a puddle or uses it as emergency kindling. When Uncle Auric replies, because of course he will, he'll say, to the child who now calls himself heir, "I took the land only to protect it. You have no oxen and less sense. If you wish to farm it, you may do so under me. Otherwise, remain silent, as befits your station." Which roughly translates to, "I'm keeping it. Cry harder." This kind of back and forth could go on for years. Literally, you'd think that a culture with limited parchment and high mortality rates would be more efficient with family disputes. But no. Every medieval family had that relative. The one who never visited, always borrowed tools without returning them, and insisted they were owed something by right. These letters could get spicy. Real fast. One son writes to his brother, "You dishonor our father's name with your idleness. You took mother's dowry ring and spent it on dice. I pray you find God, or, failing that, a useful trade." Ouch. Another writes, "Dearest sister, your absence at the funeral was noted. Your gifts were not. May God guide your soul toward humility, and your purse toward generosity." Translation, nice of you to skip Dad's funeral, Karen. Even the parents got in on it. One 14th century English father wrote to his son, who had left for London to study, read, "Party. You left without blessing or word. Your mother weeps. Your dog died. Send news or send coin. Preferably both. A real hope you're doing well, by the way we're dying vibe." Sometimes, family letters were written by children, either dictated to someone literate or scratched out in charmingly awful handwriting that looks like someone tried to train a squirrel to write with its tail. A preserved letter from a 10-year-old to his father says, "Father, I have been good. I have swept the floor and said my prayers. I wish for a whistle and a hen to chase." Wholesome. Until you realize it was written during a plague year and the father probably never got it. But hey, medieval life wasn't all disease and sadness. Just, mostly. Family letters could also be heartfelt. A mother writes to her daughter, recently married and sent to a distant manor, "My dear girl, I miss your laughter in the mornings. Is your husband kind? Do you eat well? I sent you honey, though I fear the jar may leak. Kiss your children for me. Do not forget your prayers." Simple, honest, tender. And then the postscript. "Tell your husband I still wait for the 2 shillings he owes me." Never not about money. A recurring theme in these letters is how people use them to maintain control at a distance. Medieval families weren't always close geographically or emotionally. If you married off your daughter to a merchant in York and you lived in Devon, you might not see her for years. So letters were a way of saying, "I'm still watching. Don't mess up." One noblewoman wrote to her niece, newly in charge of a household, "You must correct the steward who grows lazy, and the maid who sings during Massachusetts guests are to be offered wine, but not the good wine. I send you these words in love and warning." That's not advice. That's veiled criticism with a side of vintage micromanagement. And in case you're wondering, yes, in-laws were just as problematic back then. Here's a preserved letter from a 13th century woman to her daughter-in-law. "Though you are now family, you must not presume upon my generosity. The linens are to remain in the family, not be cut into swaddling cloths for your brats. Speak to my son more softly. He is used to better." Brutal. It's like the medieval version of subtweeting, but with more calligraphy and less electricity. Of course, not everyone could afford a personal scribe. So some letters were dictated to priests or monks, which made them awkward. Imagine trying to tell your cousin that you're not repaying that loan because you spent it on a horse, but the guy writing it is Brother Godfrey, a Cistercian monk who's never sinned in his life. So the letter ends up reading, "Regrettably, the funds were redirected to urgent transport needs. May your heart remain generous and your complaints silent. Also, may Christ return your lent silver with interest." It sounds holy. It's not. It's just an elegant way to say, "I spent your money. Deal with it." And then there are estate letters, basically long passive-aggressive scrolls written by one sibling trying to explain why they, and only they, should inherit grandma's butter churn in the good chair. They go like this. "As the eldest and the only one who remained to care for her in her final days, I believe it right that the land and the mule come to me. I trust my brothers will see the sense in this and not embarrass themselves by contesting it." Q3 brothers writing back, "Dear liar, she never liked you." This would spiral into decades-long legal disputes, threats of curses, and one unfortunate event where someone allegedly poisoned the family mead. He was acquitted, but everyone stopped drinking anything he brought to feasts. So, to sum up, medieval family letters were emotional landmines wrapped in goatskin. They contained genuine affection, unhinged accusations, vague threats involving saints, a lot of debt, one passive-aggressive list of items not returned since 1362. But you know what? They were human, raw, frustrated, funny, familiar. Because whether it's 1265 or 2025, family drama never dies. It just gets sent via slower mail. You seal your own letter with wax, your cousin's name still fresh on your tongue, and send it with the village courier. He's 14, allergic to horses, and vaguely smells like turnips. You know it won't get there for 2 weeks. But still, you hope it makes an impression. Even if that impression is mostly "I will absolutely sue you for the chic." You wake up in a cold stone room that someone has optimistically referred to as the apprentice quarters. It's less room and more enclosed dampness. The straw mattress you slept on has achieved sentience. It moves when you do. It may have fleas. You're not sure if you're dreaming or being judged by a cluster of beetles in the corner. The bell in the town square rings, and that means 2 things. You're late. You now owe your master 5 pence for the delay, plus 2 units of shame. You stagger to your feet, toss on your one tunic, the scratchy one, and rush out to start your job. You are now, officially, an employee in medieval Europe. Congratulations. There is no dental. There are no days off. There is a 17% chance you will be murdered by livestock. Now let's talk about what happens when you, a humble worker, need to write a letter to someone above your station. Maybe it's your boss. Maybe it's the reeve. Maybe it's a merchant who forgot to pay you. Or maybe you're writing a desperate note to your master to say, "Please forgive me for setting fire to the candle-making shed. It was an accident." Probably. The point is, your job is in danger, your dignity is fading, and the only way to salvage both is with some exquisitely worded parchment groveling. Let's begin with the most common genre. "Dear Master, I regret existing." A 14th century apprentice once wrote, "To my most honorable and skilled master, whose talents are known from London to Lynn, I humbly beg your pardon for my lateness. The ox I was tending did defecate upon my cloak, and I did not wish to approach you smelling of filth. Please do not beat me. I remain your faithful servant, even while sore of ankle and full of guilt. There is no timestamp on this letter, but it absolutely has written at 3 a.m. by candlelight while sobbing into hay energy. Workplace letters like this are fascinating. They are equal parts apology, compliment, and subtle threat. You had to butter up your employer and make your case without sounding like you were demanding anything. Because if you sounded too confident, you'd be dismissed. Or flogged. Or dismissed and flogged, with a bonus insult about your parentage. But if you didn't write at all, your master might assume you'd run off to join a band of traveling actors, which was the medieval equivalent of quitting to start a podcast. Here's another letter. My noble lord and employer, I remain at your service in the dye house. I ask only for new shoes, for the ones I have do leak. I have caught cough from wet floors, and I fear I may die before the cloth does. Wordplay. Always a gamble. And yet, these letters weren't always desperate. Sometimes they were just informational. A manager writing to his absent landlord. The harvesters grow lazy. They drink ale in the shade and speak of rebellion. The miller's boy has vanished. I believe he has taken the mule. I await further instruction. This is, essentially, the medieval version of an Excel report. Staff morale, low. Productivity, declining. Mule, stolen. Then there's the overlooked but extremely relatable genre. I swear I did the thing, please believe me. Like this letter from a cathedral custodian to the bishop. Your Grace. The tapestries have been cleaned. The dust from the south wall has been swept. The mouse infestation remains active. I have set traps, but they grow clever. I fear they may form a union. We are not saying that cathedral mice were intelligent, but we're not saying it either. Another delightful entry comes from a man working in a coinment, who wrote, to the overseer, I did not take the silver. I did not eat the silver. I do not know who ate the silver. Please tell the guards to stop watching me so closely. This letter raises many questions. Primarily, who eats silver? And how much silver must go missing before you need to deny consumption? But perhaps the most brutal workplace letters are references. Yes, those existed too. Let's say your apprentice finally completes his term and wants to go get a job somewhere else. He'll need a letter of recommendation. Here's what that might look like. To whom it may concern. The bearer of this letter, Thomas of Hexton, served in my shop for 7 years. He is diligent, if slow. Honest, if not always clean. He never stole more than bread. I wish him success elsewhere. This is the medieval equivalent of he's a hard worker when supervised closely and not actively on fire. Some were even less subtle. I release John of Tilney from service. He departs of his own will, though not by my wish. Do not lend him knives. And that was positive compared to what bosses wrote about servants who ran away. Because let's be clear, fleeing your job was technically theft of labor. A disgruntled innkeeper once wrote, Be it known that Alice, formerly in my service, has fled. She took with her 2 spoons and a small pot. She is 5 feet tall, has a limp, and pretends to speak no English when questioned. Reward for her return, 1 penny and a blessing. Welcome to medieval HR. No 401k, but plenty of character assassination. Of course, not all workplace letters were top-down. Sometimes, workers wrote to each other, especially in guilds or trade networks. Imagine being a weaver in Norwich writing to another weaver in Flanders. Brother in craft. The dye you sent was weak. The cloth turned pink instead of red. My buyers laughed. My wife laughed. I demand a refund or vengeance. Imagine being publicly humiliated by pastel wool. Your entire livelihood ruined by a badly mixed bucket of beetles. Then there's the beloved workplace favorite. Please send supplies. I'm dying. A castle steward wrote. We lack candles, pitch, oats, wine, meat, butter, eggs, and knives. The guards sleep in the kitchens. The cook has threatened to leave. The chickens are dead. The pigs are angry. Send help. This was addressed to the castle's absentee lord, who was off in France being extremely bad at war. The response? Hold until Michaelmas. Spend only what is needed. Trust in God. So, basically, LOL good luck. But maybe the best example of medieval workplace communication comes from a 13th century clerk working in a legal office. He wrote this on a scrap of parchment, which somehow survived. "I am bored. The cases are endless. My back aches. My ink is poor. I fear madness. Tell John he owes me a pie." That's it. That's the whole message. A slice of suffering, topped with existential dread and meat filling. So what have we learned from all this? Medieval workers wrote to apologize, beg, report, gossip, and occasionally confess. The best letters balanced desperation with flattery. Complaining was common, especially when your wages included turnips and sadness. If something went missing, blame mice or heretics. And always ask for better shoes. You finish your shift. Your hands are stained with dye. Your back aches. Your master mutters something about the quality of apprentices these days, and you consider writing a letter. Not to complain. Just to remind him you exist. You put quill to parchment. "To my honorable master. I remain, as always, beneath your expectations." And you seal it with wax. Because even in the worst jobs, in the worst times, we still want to be seen. Even if it's just long enough to be underpaid. You wake up in a narrow wooden bed. It creaks like it's composing a sad song. There's a draft coming from somewhere, probably the wall. Your feet are cold. Your soul is colder. You are 20 years old. You're wearing a linen shift that smells like disappointment and rosemary. And you are in love. You've never touched this person. You've barely spoken. But they did pass you in the marketplace once, and you are now convinced they are your destiny, your twin flame, your soulmate, your spiritual bomb, and your future excuse for why you'll one day be excommunicated. Your heart is pounding. You grab a quill. You're going to write to them. But carefully. Because it's 1325, and this is dangerous territory. You can't just text someone a heart emoji and a poorly spelled compliment. No, you need to navigate a moral obstacle course of chastity, suspicion, and potentially arranged marriage. So you write, "To the most radiant star in God's firmament, I write not out of lust, but of admiration, and possibly divine inspiration. When you smiled last Thursday, I felt the heavens open. I have not slept. I have not eaten. My mother says I'm being ridiculous. I disagree. May I offer you a rose? Or a sheep? I own both. Yours in pious affection, Stephen, the cooper's son." Congratulations. You've just composed a perfectly mediocre love letter. Let's look at how the real pros did it. Letter from a 12th century nobleman to his maybe girlfriend. "Lady of my breath, I wake thinking of you. I sleep thinking of you. I bathe rarely, and yet I would wash twice if you bid it. Your face haunts me like a just punishment. I wish to kiss your shadow. I remain tormented and also extremely chaste. Yours, Sir Aldred, who regrets everything except loving you." Was this letter effective? Unclear. But it did include bath-related self-awareness, which is rare. And don't with the wrong idea, women wrote, too. Here's one from a 14th century nun. Yes, a nun. "My beloved in Christ, I pray this finds you well and untouched by sin. I pray also that you remain unkissed, unloved, and unaware of other women. When I think of your eyes, I forget my prayers. When I remember your voice, I forget Latin. This is a problem. My confessor says I should cease. I have not. May God forgive me. And may he guard your hands from harlots. Sister Mirabelle, Abbey of St. Agnes." This is not just romantic. This is Olympic-level guilt flirting. But romantic letters weren't all pious agony and doomed passion. Sometimes they were surprisingly crude. Like this gem from a 15th century merchant's daughter. "I heard your wife died. That is sad. But you still have your hair, and I like that. If you come by the fish market next Thursday, I will be near the barrels. I will wear blue. Say nothing. Just wink. J." That's it. That's the whole letter. It might be the most effective communication in this entire video. Let's break down some types of medieval love letters, shall we? Type 1. My passion has ruined my health. This was wildly popular. Because nothing says romance like involuntary sweating and psychosomatic chest pain. "To my beloved, I eat no bread. I cannot taste meat. I drink water, but it scorns me. I saw you once in the cathedral. Your veil caught the light, and I knew peace was a lie. I coughed blood this morning. I think it is your fault. Send word soon, or I shall perish. Modern version, you up. Type 2, love with a side of theological anxiety. Because in medieval Europe, loving someone meant risking eternal damnation. Fun. Dear Thomas, when I see you, I feel joy and guilt. I think of you when I pray. This seems bad. The priest says God watches all things. I hope he blinks sometimes. I miss your teeth. Yours in terror. Marjorie. Not your typical Hallmark message. But hey, at least she's honest. Type 3, love is transaction. Often written by ambitious young men, with no land but lots of charm. Most esteemed Lady Adeline. I am 25. I can read. I own a horse. I am not a knight, but I hope to be stabbed nobly soon. If you marry me, I shall not die of sadness. If you refuse, I shall probably still live, but it will be sadder. Please consider this alliance of affection and modest ambition. Robert of no real title. The medieval version of I'm between jobs but very emotionally available. Sometimes, love letters were intercepted. And then things got spicy. There's a record from 1371 of a monk who received a romantic note from a local baker's daughter, written on a pastry wrapper. It read, I know you take the morning bread. Take this note, too. I like your silence. I like your eyes. I hope your hands are soft. If you ever leave the order, I will wait. If not, I still like the way you bless things. He never responded. Probably because his abbot found it and made him do penance by copying psalms with a broken quill. Love letters were dangerous, especially for women. If your father found out you'd been sending notes to a stable boy, you could be locked up, married off, or banished to your aunt's convent, where the main hobby was praying and collecting spider skeletons. But people still wrote. Because love, or something like it, will always survive terrible handwriting and bad Latin. And now, just for fun, a few real phrases pulled from actual medieval letters of passion. Your voice sings in my spine like angels with sore feet. My sleep is bruised by your absence. I await your hand as the field awaits rain, stupidly and full of worms. If I die, I wish it to be during a kiss. Or perhaps after one. Kissing is fine. And this classic closer. If you love me, write back. If you do not, return this letter with a frown drawn on the back. Either way, I need closure. Yes. The eternal need for emotional resolution. Even in 1298. You set down your quill. Your pulse has calmed. You still smell faintly of garlic and anxiety. But you're satisfied. Because you did it. You put your heart on parchment. You used the good ink. You didn't even cry this time. Maybe they'll write back. Maybe they won't. But for a moment, in a cold little bed, in a cold little town, in a world full of taxes and lice and monks yelling about temptation, you felt warm. And really, what else is love, if not a brief escape from everything else? You wake up itchy. There are 6 reasons why, and none of them are good. Your wool blanket is laced with fleas. Your chamber pot is full and too close to your sleeping face. The rooster outside has been crowing for what feels like 3 hours. He sounds both jubilant and threatening. Also, your neighbor's goat has eaten your cabbage garden. Again. You are furious. You are not going to take this lying down, except you are lying down, because your back hurt from that time you fell off the thatched roof during a pigeon rescue. But emotionally, you are upright. You will write a letter, a complaint, a formal, passive-aggressive, parchment-based tantrum. Welcome to the noblest tradition of medieval correspondence, whining. Because nothing says civilization like people writing long, elegant rants about pigs wandering into churches and neighbors brewing beer that tastes of Satan's foot. So before you scratch your flea bites and draft your petty masterpiece, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Only if this deep dive into historical passive aggression is your bedtime jam. And do let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. It's always oddly soothing to picture someone listening to this while trying to fall asleep in a very different time zone. Now, quill up. We're getting petty. Let's begin with the format. A proper medieval complaint letter always follows a pattern. Polite greeting, even though you're already seething. Unreasonable flattery, just to soften the blow. Extremely specific grievance. Veiled threat or biblical reference. Sign-off that implies both moral superiority and legal leverage. Here's a realish example from around 1390. To the most honorable and God-fearing Lord Henry, I greet you in peace and humility, and pray that your fields remain ever lush. However, it has come to my attention that your pigs have once again trampled my barley patch. I counted 9. One was limping. I named him Disrespect. If this offense is not remedied, I shall be forced to take the matter to Brother Oswin, who enjoys drama. May God keep you, and also consider pestilence. Yours with deep concern, Matthew, keeper of barley and grudges. In modern terms, hi, just checking in. Your animals are destroying my property, and I hate you in a Christian way. Now, you might be thinking, surely not everyone wrote complaint letters. That sounds exhausting. Oh, they did. Especially monks. Monks were masters of the formal complaint. Imagine a monastery. Peaceful, quiet, full of illuminated manuscripts and the smell of damp stone. Now imagine Brother Gerald has stolen your special ink again, the one with the crushed lapis pigment you only use on feast days. You're not allowed to yell. So you write, Dear Brother Gerald, may the Lord bless your scriptorium. I write to you in the spirit of fraternal correction. The absence of my blue ink has been noted, as has your manuscript on St. Cuthbert, which is now suspiciously vibrant. Should you wish to avoid further conversation with Prior Benedict, who has not eaten cheese this week and is thus volatile, I suggest we speak quietly. In Christ. Brother Martin, illuminator and victim. Monastic complaint letters were basically holy HR memos. But secular folk weren't shy either. Peasants could lodge complaints to their lords. Lords could write to bishops. Bishops could write to kings. Kings wrote to everyone, usually in tones best described as condescending thunder. Let's look at a famous example. In 1255, a disgruntled miller wrote to his local bailiff, Sir, the tax on my grain has doubled, and yet the weight of my sorrow remains constant. The wheel is broken, the stream is dry, and I suspect the man from the next village has cursed my donkey. I request mercy, or at least a new donkey. Yours beneath the weight of hardship. Elias the Unfortunate. This letter has it all: despair, poetic suffering, accusations of rural witchcraft. And it probably didn't help. But you have to admire the effort. One of the most common complaints? Animal-related crimes. Your sheep are trespassing. Your rooster is loud and possibly possessed. Your ox defecated in my doorway. Again. Your geese have formed a gang. Medieval livestock were basically anarchists. But humans weren't much better. Complaint letters often included accusations of adultery with or without evidence. Accusations of sorcery, frequent, dramatic. Disputes over land borders, based on mud and stubbornness. Disputes over who stole whose ale recipe, this was deadly serious. One letter from 1423 reads, Let it be known that Mistress Hilda's ale is bitter, thin, and made with unclean water. Her claim to my hops is false. I have witnesses. Also, her cat is a thief. Agnes, brewer of honest beverages. Honestly, give Agnes a podcast. She's killing it. Let's pause for a moment to talk about the sheer physical effort involved in complaining back then. You didn't have a laptop. You had a dull quill, a candle that kept going out, ink made from wasp nests and sadness, a parchment that smelled faintly of goat, a hand cramp that lasted 3 days. So if someone sat down and still wrote you a 4-page letter about your rude dog, they meant it. Sometimes the complaints were funny. Sometimes they were heartbreaking. One from 1368. I write to say the cart you sold me has splinters in the seat and no moral integrity. My wife fell off it and cursed our marriage. You said it was sturdy. It is not. I will pray for your honesty to return. Slowly. Godwin. This is a medieval version of a bad Yelp review, but with more divine shame. But let's not forget the pettiest kind. Complaint letters to heaven. Yes. People wrote prayers that doubled as complaint letters, blaming God for everything from poor harvest to marital disappointment. One monk wrote, Lord, why must the rats come every winter? Why must my joints ache and my boots leak? Why must Brother Andrew sing flat? I seek only answers. And perhaps thicker socks. Amen. If that isn't relatable, you may be too well adjusted. Sometimes, letters were just elaborate burns. Like this one, written from one noble to another after a particularly bad feast. Your hospitality was inventive. The meat was surprising. The wine had opinions. The bread was biblical in texture. I await the day I may host you in return and exact justice through poultry. With deepest respect, Sir Edwin. Translation: Your dinner gave me food poisoning, and I will avenge myself with casserole. Before we drift toward the end of this chapter, one final gem. A letter of complaint to a candle maker circa 1401. To the maker of light. I write to inform you that the candles I purchased last Tuesday have failed in both brightness and scent. One sputtered. One hissed. One summoned bees. I ask for a refund, or at least fewer insects. In darkness and mild rage. Henry the Saddler. Truly, Shakespeare missed out on candle-based drama. So what have we learned? That medieval people had bad days. That they wrote it down. That complaint is eternal. That your neighbor stealing your garlic in 1347 is spiritually identical to someone double parking in your spot today. And that there's something deeply comforting, maybe even soothing, about knowing that even 700 years ago, people were lying awake at night, composing letters in their heads that began with, "Dear Sir, with all due respect, you are a plague upon my fence and my patience. Now roll over. Close your eyes. Try not to think about the goat you named disrespect. You wake up in a cold sweat. Something's wrong. You can feel it deep in your soul, somewhere near your spleen, or maybe the part of your brain that stores moral panic. You had a dream about judgment, about fire, about St. Peter shaking his head slowly at you like a disappointed uncle. Then you remember. The cheese. You ate your brother-in-law's cheese. The good cheese. The cheese he said was for Easter. And it's only Lent. You are a criminal. A dairy criminal. You will need to write an apology. A letter. A confession dressed in flowery language and plausible deniability. And you will need to do it in a way that says, "I am sorry," while also gently implying that maybe, just maybe, he should have labeled the cheese more clearly. Welcome to Medieval Apology Letters, the original, long-form, guilt-laced notes app statements. But with more ink smudges, more saints invoked, and far fewer lawyers. So go ahead and fluff your pillow, dim the lantern, and take a slow breath. And if you haven't already, like the video and subscribe, but only if you're the kind of person who appreciates a 700-year-old letter that opens with "I was drunk and my mule was on fire." And in the comments, tell me, what time is it where you are, and what are you trying to forget so you can sleep? I'll read every confession. Silently. Judgmentally. Now, let's go back to the year 1342, and the slowest, most poetic apology in cheese-related history. Apology letters in the Middle Ages were a genre. They had structure. They had drama. And most importantly, they had an audience, because half the time, they weren't even private. People copied them, circulated them, and sometimes even read them aloud in court, in church, or to passive-aggressive relatives during feast days. It's like getting your apology email posted on the town notice board. Except the board is made of wood and smells like mildew and betrayal. A typical medieval apology letter contains a formal greeting, because groveling should be polite. A statement of offense, ideally poetic, occasionally vague. A flood of religious guilt, lots of saints and shame. An elaborate excuse, usually nature-related. A plea for mercy or divine intervention. A gift or offering, sometimes wine, sometimes a goat, sometimes your firstborn. A conclusion that implies you'll never do it again, you will. Let's look at one from a 15th century merchant who accidentally insulted a nobleman's daughter at a feast. To the most honorable Sir Godfrey, whose table is bounteous and whose family is radiant. I write in sorrow and ash, for my tongue betrayed me like Judas with sarcasm. I spoke out of turn, perhaps due to the richness of your meats or the confusion of foreign spices. I did not mean to suggest your daughter resembled a stoat, nor imply her laugh called to mind the mating cry of goats. I was weary and perhaps enchanted by the full moon. I send with this letter a small cask of honeyed wine and a prayer candle shaped like the Virgin. May we dine again in peace, or at least in silence. Yours in groveling humility, Stephen, who deeply regrets speaking. Honestly, same energy as an email that begins, "Per my last message, I was being an idiot." But not all apology letters were quite so fancy. Sometimes they were downright tragic. Imagine a young scribe sent to apprentice in a cathedral town who writes back home to his parents after ruining a manuscript. Father, I dropped the book of Psalms into the fire. I write to you from a place of darkness, both spiritual and literal, for the prior has taken my candle privileges. I know not how I tripped. I suspect the devil. Please forgive me. I shall not eat meat until Whitsun. I enclose a small drawing of the Virgin in ink as penance. I remain your sorrowful son. Auric. Auric's going through it. And let's be honest, if you've ever sent a typo-filled work email at 2 a.m. that said Dear Brain instead of Dear Brian, you are Auric. Let's talk about romantic apology letters. Now, medieval people were not always open about their feelings. But when they were, oh, it was spectacularly messy. A real letter from a knight to a lady, c. 1307. Dearest Beatrice, I have heard you ride now with Lord Edmund. I cannot fault you. He has a strong jaw and 3 horses. But I must confess that when last we parted, I should not have kissed your hand as though it were a common relic. I was overrun with emotion. And mead. I pray you remember our walks by the moat and the time I composed you that ballad. I know it mentioned weasels. I was nervous. Should you forgive me, I shall attend the tournament in green. If not, I shall attend in sackcloth. Ever your fool. Sir Roland. If that isn't medieval I miss you energy, I don't know what is. And yes, she married Edmund. He had 3 horses. What did Roland expect? Apologies weren't just personal. Whole towns sometimes wrote apology letters. After riots. Or bad harvests. Or extremely questionable miracle plays involving actors getting a little too enthusiastic with symbolic violence. One from a parish to their bishop. Your Grace, we regret the events of St. Stephen's Day. The donkey was not meant to be lit on fire. Brother Giles mistook the signal. We humbly request you send another donkey. We have banned ale until Pentecost. Yours in smoking repentance. The people of Nether Shambleby. There are more sincere regrets in that one letter than in a modern politician's entire press conference. But my favorite category of apology? The Please Don't Kill Me letter. Often written by lower lords or merchants after being caught slightly rebelling against a king, bishop, or angry baron. These letters usually contain excessive praise, blame shifting, emotional blackmail, gifts often of livestock or siblings in marriage. Example circa 1280. To His Radiant Highness, Lord of all marshlands and bringer of justice. I write not as a traitor, but as a man misled by fog and poor counsel. I did not mean to withhold taxes. I believed the harvest was mine by divine confusion. My men who built the catapult did so out of enthusiasm, not malice. I enclose 4 barrels of cider, 2 oxen, and my cousin Matilda, who is comely and obedient. Spare my lands, and I shall name my next child after your favorite saint. Lord Edgar, who deeply misjudged the mood. You can almost smell the desperation. And the cider. Not all apologies were accepted. Sometimes the offended party would write back a rejection letter dressed in righteousness. One noblewoman to her former betrothed, 1382. My lord, I received your letter and the goat. Neither were satisfactory. I do not forgive your behavior at the feast, where you did speak ill of my mother, whose ears are perfectly average. The poem you included was confusing and included the phrase, throbbing valor, which is inappropriate. I shall marry Bernard. He speaks less and owns land. Lady Isolde, who is done with you? Let's all be Lady Isolde. Of course, not every apology was written with ink. Sometimes people made public apologies in the middle of the village in itchy sackcloth with a bell around their neck, while a monk yelled at them for stealing apples. But let's be honest. Sometimes it's easier to just write a letter. At midnight. In the cold. With a guilty heart and an upset stomach full of ill-gotten cheese. So what can we learn? That people have always messed up. That guilt is timeless. That apologies, even poetic ones, are often just elaborate ways of saying I panicked. And that if you ever feel bad about something you said in 2009 on Facebook, just remember, someone in 1376 once accidentally called a bishop's niece a goose-faced witch, and then had to spend 3 weeks writing a heartfelt poem about how that was meant as a compliment. So sleep easy. You're not the first person to regret a midnight snack, a drunken speech, or a badly timed joke about a stoat. You wake up to the sound of scratching quills and the gentle weeping of a troubadour outside your window. It's 1324 and someone has feelings. Too many of them? Really? Feelings that cannot be shouted or tweeted or awkwardly communicated through a passive-aggressive Spotify playlist. No, these feelings must be written in flowery script with dramatic pauses, biblical references, and a questionable understanding of human anatomy. Yes, it's time for Medieval Love Letters, the original Overthink Us mixtape. This is where romance lives in its purest, most ridiculous form. Forget DMs, forget heart emojis. We're talking about full-blown literary hallucinations written on lambskin vellum. These people were in love, and they were absolutely, spectacularly terrible at it. So take a breath, tuck the bedsheets around your shoulders like a woolen cloak of vulnerability, and let your mind float gently into a world where calling someone a jewel of virtue counted as flirting. And hey, if you're still awake, this is your casual reminder to like the video, subscribe if you're into weird history and sleepy sarcasm, and tell me in the comments what country you're listening from and what the weirdest love note you ever got was. I once received a napkin that just said, "You smell like books." Romantic? Maybe. Anyway, let's go find out how you got a date before deodorant existed. Love letters in the Middle Ages were not casual. They were monastic events. Writing one was like composing scripture while crying into your porridge. And receiving one? A full-blown crisis. You'd get your best friend to read it first. You'd hide it in your prayer book. You'd pretend to faint for dramatic effect. The average medieval love letter had more layers than a 3-day-old onion soup. Here's the usual recipe. A humble salutation, because nothing says love like calling yourself your humble worm. Praise of the recipient's physical and spiritual beauty. Metaphors that go completely off the rails. You are the moon, the stars, the Pope's favorite bread. Personal suffering. Your absence makes me a corpse. My breath freezes without you, etc. A declaration of eternal loyalty, unless a better match comes along with more chic. Religious analogies, so intense they make modern poetry look emotionally stable. Let's begin with one of the most famous categories, courtly love. Courtly love was basically the medieval version of workplace sexual tension, always just out of reach, painfully polite, and deeply impractical. It usually involved a knight writing to a lady of higher social status, one he couldn't legally touch, or speak to, or sometimes even look at directly. But that didn't stop him from writing something like this. My lady, since last I saw thee, the sun has not warmed me, nor have birds sung as sweet. My heart is your captive, shackled by your virtue, and beaten by your radiant grace. I dream of your face even in prayer. I confess that your smile has become my litany. I know I am not worthy. I am but a worm, a mud-stained knave, a soup-eater. But still, I dare to love. If you return my affections, wear the blue ribbon at the tourney. If not, I shall ride into the sea. Eternally yours. Sir Edric of the Unstable Emotions. Sir Edric is going through some things. You want to give him a hug, a therapist, and a very cold bath. But not all letters were about longing. Some were about intentions. Medieval marriage proposals, believe it or not, were often disguised as spiritual offerings. Because nothing says let's get married like pretending it's a pilgrimage. A letter from a nobleman to a merchant's daughter, 1421. Dearest Lady Clarice, I write to inquire whether your father might accept a union, for I find your manner pleasing and your dowry acceptable. I have 4 fields, 3 goats, and a moderately pious heart. My knees are strong. My teeth are sound. I attend Mass regularly. Should you accept, I shall build a bench beneath the yew tree, where we might sit and observe the barley. I await your blessing. Geoffrey, who owns half a mill and a fully functioning elbow. Clarice married him. Apparently, the elbow thing really sealed the deal. Now let's get a little darker. Because some love letters were written from afar. During war, from the edge of plague zones, or from dungeons where writing involved scratching Latin into damp wood and hoping a sympathetic monk would mail it. A knight writing from a siege in France, 1360. To my dearest Agnes, I send this from beneath a ruined wall, with mud in my boots and longing in my chest. The battle goes poorly, as do the rations. I have not bathed since St. Andrew's Day. The lice are numerous and devout. Yet in the cold, I think only of your hands, your voice, the way you once poured ale with such elegance. If I fall, know that my heart died first, when we parted. If I live, I shall kiss your name into every breeze until we meet. Yours in armor and yearning, Thomas, who smells like iron and regret. It's both poetic and itchy. Sometimes, people got weirdly philosophical, especially monks who had taken vows of celibacy but were still, human. One letter from a cloistered monk to a former lover reads, "My soul belongs to God, but my dreams still wander to the orchard where we once spoke. I confess I have seen your face in the Virgin statue and feared for my sanity. I pray for you nightly, not for salvation, but for peace. Know that if this life were different, I would have built you a chapel with my bare hands. Brother Anselm, who asks only for a whisper in your prayers. Brother Anselm, you dog." And yes, of course, there were dirty ones. Not as many survive, because monks weren't exactly excited to preserve 13th century texts on illuminated parchment. But they existed, usually veiled in metaphor, but sometimes not. From a woman to her husband, away at sea. My body is cold without you. I sleep alone, and even the blanket is indifferent. Return soon, or I shall burn from within like a heretic's barrel. I have oiled the bedposts. Your wife, who waits with increasing urgency. That one spicy and practical. She's thinking ahead. Then there's unrequited love. The absolute backbone of medieval sadness. Letters that begin with hope and end in despair, with people comparing themselves to melting wax, crumbling bread, or forgotten pewter spoons. From a scribe to a lady who never responded. My lady, I have written thrice and received no answer. I fear your heart has turned colder than a Saxon's breakfast. Still, I write once more, for hope is a cruel and stupid flame. If I am forgotten, so be it. But know this, I shall name my next goat after you. Forever yours, unless you tell me otherwise. John of Wiltshire, professional disappointment. He never heard back. The goat was named Eleanor. So what does all this tell us? That people have always been weird about love. They've always fumbled for the right words, used too many metaphors, compared feelings to livestock, rewritten their letters 12 times, spelled yearning wrong and cried into their inkwells. It's comforting, in a way, to know that 700 years ago, someone else was lying awake in their medieval dorm room, wondering if they should send that letter. If my heart is your goblet sounded too intense. If they just ruined everything by using the word moist in a sonnet. So if you've ever sent a cringe message at 2 a.m., don't worry. You're part of a proud tradition. And with that, we slide deeper into the parchment-scented night.